Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by NordVPN. So, I want to talk about Spider-Man, which is not exactly unusual on this channel, I know. But this week, I really felt like honing in on one specific version, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. I've made videos about the Amazing Spider-Man movies and Far From Home, but this week I want to talk about the future of Spider-Man. Specifically, how Garfield's Spidey could be used in new and interesting ways. Because I really do think there's still a place for this particular Peter Parker. The actor stole scenes left and right in No Way Home, and is one of the definite highlights of that movie. And while I still have some real issues with how the character was depicted in the ASM films, I don't think many of them come down to Andrew Garfield's actual performance. So let's talk about how, if he ever decides to return, he could best be used going forward.
What is more pure than good against evil? Wakey, wakey, Spider-Man.
Whenever I talk about the moves that Sony could make to improve their Spider-Man universe movies, I get a lot of comments saying that they should just stop making them, give the character back to Disney, etc. And I get it, believe me, I watched Morbius in theaters, I know how dire these Sony movies can be. But they're kind of not going anywhere. Sony is hell-bent on not losing the character and will continue pumping these things out for the foreseeable future. Sometimes, by the way, to pretty great effect. Even if you want to give Feige and company all the credit for the Holland films, Sony still managed to put out Into the Spider-Verse, which is a far more interesting and enjoyable movie than almost anything the MCU has put out lately. But on the live action side, I think it's clear they need to drastically change course, and the Andrew Garfield Spidey might just be the ingredient needed to do that. In my After Morbius video, I talked about the possibility of Garfield's Peter appearing in the next Venom film. I still think that would be a good idea, but if anything, I think it should be expanded far beyond that. Venom is a character that can and has supported his own comic book title for years, but few other Spider-Man villains can really do that, Morbius being a prime example. He's already not the most exciting foe in Spidey's rogues gallery to begin with, and now they were asking him to carry a whole movie. The Jared Leto of it all didn't help, but at the end of the day, I think this was just always a bad idea, regardless of the actor. I mean, when the trailers for Morbius initially came out, what were people excited about? For most, it definitely wasn't the chance to finally see Dr. Michael Morbius on the big screen. If they were excited at all, which granted is a pretty big if when it comes to this movie, it was because of the Spider-Man connections that the trailer showed off. Like the Vulture and that Spider-Man poster that was taken directly from the PS4 game for some reason. If you've seen the movie, you know that nearly all of that was removed once the film's release date was pushed behind No Way Home. Vulture's appearance was mostly confined to an extremely clumsy post-credits scene, and the Spider-Man poster was nowhere to be found. It made the whole thing feel extremely low rent and inessential, which was pretty accurate. I could keep ranting about Morbius all day, but really, if they're going to continue down this path of making villain-centric movies, and it definitely seems like they are, I think they really need to rethink how they go about it from the ground up. Venom is one thing, but for most of these guys, not having Spider-Man there makes very little sense, because that connection is often the only reason anyone cares about them in the first place. So here's a simple idea: put Spider-Man in the movies that are about Spider-Man characters. Could this still be a disaster? I mean, of course, Sony still needs far better quality control here and shouldn't be shoving these movies out the door just because they managed to land a movie star. All of that could still happen with or without Spider-Man. But I do think, if executed well, it would be a unique and interesting twist on the usual superhero formula. Seeing a Spider-Man story play out from the perspective of a villain or anti-hero isn't new in the comics, but I do think it could feel really fresh on the big screen. Especially since so many of Spidey's villains reflect back on Peter Parker himself in a way that's potentially really interesting. These would be their stories, not his, but he could actually play an important part in the narrative, instead of being a no-show and robbing all these characters of the reason they exist in the first place. Seeing Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man from a few different characters' perspectives would not only be unique, but potentially a way to build a great take on the character. Venom 3 would be the obvious place to start, but one idea I've always loved is an adaptation of J.M. DeMatteis and Mike Zeck's Kraven's Last Hunt. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It is nuts to me that we're getting all these villain films and no one is touching that story. The series sees Kraven burying Peter alive and attempting to take on the Spider-Man mantle himself, desperate to prove he's superior in every way before he can finally let go. Not only does it feature a fantastic character arc for Spidey himself, who when the comic came out was a slightly older Peter married to Mary Jane, it's also, and maybe even more prominently, an amazing Kraven story. It's a real character study of these two men, where both of them get plenty of time to shine. And it would be a great vehicle for both Andrew Garfield and an actor playing Kraven. It seems like there's just always a Kraven movie in development, but from what I've read, none of them are really drawing on this story specifically. Which I think is a shame, not just because it's one of the character's best, but also because it's so radically different from anything the MCU Spider-Man is doing. Which I think is hugely important here. These movies can't feel like MCU films, or what's more likely, a bad attempt at copying the MCU style. They need to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and excite people by being their own thing. Like how Morbius was marketed seemed entirely built around fooling general audiences into thinking it's the latest MCU offering. Not only is that dishonest, it's also just really lame. To fans, it immediately makes the movie feel like a tacked on also-ran before the movie has even opened. Instead of constantly positioning their movies as vaguely MCU adjacent, Sony could take advantage of the fact that they're not bound by all the baggage of the MCU. They could take bold swings, with a stylishly shot, more unconventional take on Kraven's Last Hunt that could be a great calling card for announcing that their Spidey villain films truly do have their own tone and flair, beyond just feeling like a by-the-numbers origin story from 2006. I think Andrew Garfield could be the perfect Spider-Man for that kind of experimentation too. No offense to Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland, who I both like a lot, but Garfield is the most accomplished actor in that group in my opinion. And he'd be able to handle a really wide variety of tones and stories easily. I want his Spider-Man to not just return, but return in a way that feels meaningful beyond just fan service. Great comics like 1994's Marvels have done a fantastic job at showing what these larger-than-life heroes look like from a completely different perspective. And I think using that as an inspiration for some of these villain films could be a great basis to build off of as well. I'd also like to see more of Peter's life after No Way Home, even if it's from another character's perspective. I think that movie was wisely a little vague on the specifics of the other Peters' lives and their worlds, and this could be a good way to explore that without just doing a straight-up Garfield Spidey movie that would directly compete with Holland's. At the end of the day though, if they're gonna keep making these movies, I just want them to be good. To have a reason to exist beyond an obvious brand extension. I think with some big adjustments and a fundamental rethinking of how they're approaching this material, Sony could eventually have some live-action movies based around Spider-Man villains that they could be as proud of as Into the Spider-Verse or Spider-Man PS4. And Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man could easily be the uniting factor behind them all. If you've got the rights to all the Spider-Man characters, there's no reason to approach it in the most boring and uninspired way possible. If Sony doesn't learn that soon on the live action end, I think they can expect a lot more box office results like Morbius.
Welcome, Spider-Man. I am Kraven, the world's greatest hunter. We can begin our glorious contest of strength.
You know, if there's one thing the Spider-Man films taught us, it's that giant companies like Oscorp are terrifying. And while, sure, they're unlikely to turn you into a Green Goblin anytime soon, it's still always a smart choice to protect your data online. That's where NordVPN comes in, offering threat protection that makes it far more than just a VPN. It's also a great cybersecurity tool. That's far from all though. If you're watching this channel, I'm guessing you're a fan of a lot of TV and movies, but sometimes the things you want to watch just aren't available where you are. Something like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia isn't on Netflix in the US, but by changing your location to the UK, you can immediately have access to it, along with tons of other titles that you just won't find on the US Netflix. This is extra helpful to gain access to streaming services which just might not be available in your country. And with so many of those popping up right now, it's never been more useful. At the end of the day, NordVPN is just an all-around better way to use the internet. So try it now with a 30-day free trial by going to nordvpn.com/captainmidnight. That's nordvpn.com/captainmidnight. which is a link you can also find in the description down below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.